something as rearranging my furniture every night. Ever since I was a young boy, I would wake up in the morning with my furniture arranged differently than when I went to sleep. Sometimes it was small, like my lamp in the wrong place, or my shoe rack was tipped over. Other days I'd wake up and the bed would be in the wrong spot. The dresser is on the wrong wall. My deck is in front of the door. In the beginning, it wasn't in a messy fashion. It seemed like a perfectly normal way to arrange my bedroom, just in a different way than I preferred. I have a very early memory from around 5 years old of my mom yelling at me for moving around all my furniture at night. I swore up and down that it wasn't me. She seemed conflicted when she was yelling at me. I wasn't a troublemaker. She knew it wasn't something I would do. But looking back now, I think she was just scared of the thought of it not being me. After a couple of hours, I convinced my mom it wasn't me. After all, I was a small kid. I don't think I could have physically moved it on my own. Next to blame was my older brother. He was 11 at the time, so it still would have been hard for him to move my stuff, but not impossible. My brother liked to mess with me. No more than any normal brother, but never any over-the-top pranks. Mostly just because he was lazy, though. No way he'd lose sleep over something so weird like moving my furniture every night. After my brother denied it, and added that he stayed at his friend's house for sleepovers, often gave him an alibi. My mom attempted to blame my dad next, but of course that comment was not taken lightly, and ended with my parents just pointing fingers at each other. My mom spent that night with me in bed. She tried her best to explain why she was sleeping in my bed without making it sound scary, but I could tell she was scared. I wasn't scared at all because it felt normal. I see now as an adult why she was freaked out. The night felt normal. If anything, it was a fun night. Like a big sleepover. My first sleepover, even. We woke up the next morning, and my mom gasped and gripped the sheets. Wait, how did this happen? I was right here. My mom looked around the room. It was pretty easy to do so, given that the bed was right in the center of the room. This hadn't happened before. It was always in a normal spot against the wall. It was like the room was showing off that it could put the bed in the middle of the room without us waking up. My mother always claimed to be a notoriously light sleeper. She said how she can't fully turn her brain off in case we need her in the night, but she always seemed to sleep deeply to me. The rest of the day, she kept insisting that someone was sleepwalking or something. She didn't think anyone was playing a prank, but she knew someone in the house was doing it. She had to believe it. My parents ordered a Serenity camera online to put in my room so they could watch the footage the next morning. They got next day delivery, so I'd have to go one more night without them being able to watch me sleep. That night, they decided to let me sleep in their bed. I was even more excited than the night before. Now this was really a sleepover. That night, my mom tucked me in tightly in between her and my dad. I remember she held me all night long. I woke up the next morning to my mom sounding terrified. My parents' bed wasn't even in the bedroom anymore. It was sitting in the living room right outside my parents' bedroom. My dad sat up and started to get as concerned as my mom. How did our bed get out here?" he whispered with a stutter. "It can't even fit through the door frame. Was it taken apart and put back together out here?" He hopped out of bed and picked me up into his arms in the process. We all stared at it, confused. Even as a young boy, I knew something was really wrong. My dad started to take the bed apart to bring it back into their bedroom, and noticed that the screws were loose. Some were even missing, like it was put back together in a rush. I remember my parents being on the phone with, I think, the police, but they never showed up. I remember my mom being upset on the phone when they wouldn't help us at all. That night, my dad installed a camera into the corner of my bedroom. My mom once again slept next to me. The camera they got was basically like a baby monitor that recorded the night. My dad had the monitor beside his bed to be an extra set of eyes. The night came and went. My mom and I woke up with my room yet again rearranged. She looked up at the camera to see that it was destroyed. All video from the night was destroyed as well. This was right around the time when baby monitors could record to an iPhone, and you could watch the video the next morning, but everything about the video was corrupted. My family went to the police station that night, insisting that someone was in our house. The cops wrote down a statement, but that's all that came of it. My parents for the next couple of years kept trying to figure out what was going on, trying different solutions to find out how this was happening, only to find dead ends over and over again. My mom started to believe the house was haunted, and after a couple of years, my dad believed her. This was the main reason for our move when I was 8. I was so excited to be done with whatever was going on. At this point, the sleepovers weren't cute. I wanted my own space. My parents didn't let me go to summer camp or stay at friends' houses like my brother did. I was sick of it. It was night 1 in the new place. It was only about 30 minutes from our old house. Not too big of a change, but just enough that I was excited. My parents felt so good about the new place that they let me sleep in my own bed. I remember they told me at dinner while we ate McDonald's over a makeshift table made of cardboard boxes. I jumped up and down and hugged them both. That night I got tucked in and my mom was hesitant to leave me in my own bed. She seemed worried but knew I needed this. My room didn't have much in it. Just my bed, dresser, and a few boxes with my clothes in them. I remember falling asleep that night and thinking how creaky the new house was. But I didn't mind. I was hopeful. I woke up the next morning before my mom and dad. I didn't have curtains yet, so the sunrise woke me. I sat up and stretched. I rubbed my eyes to wake myself up, and I immediately felt a knot in my throat. The furniture was moved. At that moment, I made a decision. I knew if my mom saw this, I'd be stuck sleeping next to her for my whole life. My little imagination took over, and I thought about coming home from my job one day as a grown man wearing a suit, and my mom still tucking me into bed. I sprung up and quickly moved everything back to where it came from. Luckily, nothing was too heavy for me to move. Just as I got everything back into place, I heard my mom's footsteps. I jumped into bed and pretended to be sleeping. She cracked the door and let out a sigh of relief and shut the door. How I wish I could go back in time and tell my mom the truth. I spent the next month doing this same routine. My mom always woke up at 7:30 to check on me, so I'd always get up at 7 and fix everything. It was exhausting but worth it. My mom was warming up to the idea of me going to summer camp, so I was motivated. My mom got comfortable enough to send me to camp. It was only a one-night camp that year, which was fine. She needed to take baby steps. I didn't think anything would happen, honestly, but when we woke up in the morning, every single bunk bed was outside, all 20 of them, 30 kids and 10 adults, all waking up feeling confused and disoriented. Some bunk beds even on their sides tipped over. Of course, the camp counselors were confused. I knew what I had to do. I gaslit all the adults into believing it was the plan of the troubled kid, Eddie. I made up a whole story about how he convinced a few other kids to do it in the night. I didn't think it was believable, but I was so convincing that everyone believed me. The camp counselors wanted to inform all the parents when they came to pick up what happened. Of course, it was a violation and needed to be explained to all the parents what happened. Luckily, I got out of it. I went to the camp with a school friend, and his mom picked us up. His mom believed me when I said I'd tell my mom myself. As the years passed by, I realized no matter where I slept, this would happen to me. I turned it into a sleepover trick. I'll tell my friends to come over, and sure enough, it would happen. I'd even sleep at their houses, and it would happen. Whenever I was trying to show off the trick, the room would be in even worse condition than a normal night. I felt like I had a superpower. The years went by, and it just became my life. It was like brushing my teeth in the morning. Now and then I'd forget to fix everything in the morning, and my mom would check on me. It only happened a few times, but each time I saw fear in her eyes. I always just said I moved stuff around the night before, because I was bored of the layout. I could only use that lie so many times, though. One time in high school, I was very sick. I was having a hard time getting up in the morning to move my furniture, and I didn't move my furniture for a couple of mornings. My mom was getting nervous, and I knew I had to get up before her to move it the next day. My mom came into my bedroom to say goodnight and let me know she'd be gone in the early morning, but would say hi as soon as she got home at around noon. This was music to my ears. I could sleep in and not worry about moving everything before she could barge in. The morning came and I got to sleep until about 11. I couldn't believe how much better I was feeling. I knew I should have probably started to move my furniture and be proactive, but of course that's not what I did. I could hear my brother in his room next door playing video games, so I went to go see what he was playing. Him being a brother, he wasn't letting me play with him, so I instead stood by his bed for way too long and annoying him. I lost track of time and heard the garage door open. My heart sank. I ran back into my room and tried to move everything back into its place. Luckily, throughout the years, I convinced my parents to get me lighter furniture. They never caught on, and it made life so much easier. Everything got replaced except for my dresser, which was a family heirloom. It wasn't all that big, but this day it felt heavy. I knew I was weak from being sick all week, but I couldn't believe how heavy it was. It was the last thing to move, but it just wouldn't budge. I frantically ran to my brother and told him I needed help moving my dresser. He leaped out of bed to run to my room. With most things, he doesn't care to help me. But I was always honest with my brother that the furniture thing never stopped. He knew that if our mom knew, our whole house would be a living hell and she might even make us move again. He always had my back when it came to my supernatural furniture. Instead of going back into my room, I went downstairs to distract my mom. I knew she'd be mad to see me out of bed, but the consequences of my furniture being out of place would be so much worse. My socks slid across the hardwood floor and I reached the kitchen, just as she was opening the door. Her happy humming was immediately interrupted when she made eye contact with me. She set a grocery bag on the counter and got out some soup she just bought at the store. I thought she was going to yell at me, but I wasn't going to question it. I figured she was being patient with me since I was sick. Just as she got out a box of popsicles, I heard an awful sound. One that I will never forget. A sound that is completely my fault. I heard my brother scream. It was a loud scream, but short, like something interrupted it. It sounded like he stubbed his toe and then covered his mouth halfway through. My mom and I made eye contact and started to head upstairs to check on him. It was too loud to be something small. We turned the corner into my room, and I didn't know what to feel. I saw my dresser still not in its normal spot, but just slightly moved from where I left it. The dresser had a big drawer on the front that opened up like a door, or a cabinet, and it was wide open and empty. But most importantly, my brother was gone. An hour went by and my brother was nowhere to be found. The doors to the house seemed to all be locked. Same with the windows. We ended up filing a missing persons report. A whole week went by, and there was no sign of him. My mom thought my brother was in the middle of moving my furniture to prank me or something and got spooked, and ran off. I didn't have the heart to tell her or anyone that I felt like this was my fault. I thought that maybe whatever was moving my stuff wanted just me to move it or something. After that awful week, we found something to make it so much worse. My dad was in my room with me and trying to ask more questions about our last interaction. A lot of people asked me this since I was the last person to see my brother. As I explained it to him for the 100th time, he was randomly looking at the dresser and opened up the big door we originally found wide open. It had a note taped to the inside. Before my dad took it, he looked nervously at me asking if it was mine, but he very well already knew the answer. We called my mom into the room before we read it. The following is an exact quote from the note. I see our little game of hide and seek did not end like I imagined. Your brother is not who I intended to find me, but he will have to do for now. We had no clue what the note meant, but that didn't stop it from sending shivers down my spine. At the very least, now we knew someone had taken my brother. We thought the cops would do more to help now that we had a note. While they did do a little more to help us find him, they never found anything else. I never saw my brother again. Last year I moved out of my parents' house. This decision was completely based on my not wanting to move my furniture around every morning. I couldn't imagine a world where I could leave my furniture as is and just sleep in without the worry of my mom seeing it. That being said, I moved out as soon as I could afford it. I moved in with my best friend and we shared an apartment. He knew about my little party trick and was never too freaked out by it. Although part of me was scared that once he saw it was legit, he would be scared. The first morning I woke up and the room was a mess. Everything was in the wrong place just as usual. Although I didn't think there would even be a usual for how my room looked anymore. I was sick of fixing it. It was going to look however it wanted to look. After a couple of days of just letting my furniture do whatever, I noticed how it was being arranged was more and more chaotic. Messier. Like the furniture was mad that I wasn't putting it all back. I started straightening things, but nothing too wild. I'd just leave the big stuff. I mean, my roommate was weirded out, but he didn't care at first. One morning, about 2 weeks into living at the new place, I woke up with my bed on our deck outside. I knew it was going to start getting out of hand. The whole reason for me moving out was to not have to move my furniture around like crazy. I was so mad. I couldn't just leave the furniture as it was. For some reason, it had to be put back to its normal spot. I let it go one more morning. I wanted to see what would happen if I left it just once more. I woke up the next day in the middle of the woods with no clue where I was. It felt like when I was a kid, and this happened with bunk beds, but this was so much worse. It was relatively easy to find my way back, but just a long walk. In all, it took me about 2 hours to get home, not to mention having to figure out how to get my bed back home. When I got back, my roommate had a chat with me. He said how he never really thought the weird furniture thing was real, and thought it was a very elaborate joke, and now that he lived with me, it was affecting his mental health. He felt paranoid and really tired and wanted me to move out. I was of course bummed, but knew it was for the best. I tried to tell him I'd start moving the furniture back every morning, and it would all be okay, but that didn't seem to help him feel better. I called my parents to tell them I was coming back home. They seemed excited to have me come home. They seemed very cheerful, actually. When I asked them what was making them so happy, they said they felt better than they had in years and felt so well rested. It felt nice to hear them happy for what felt like the first time since my brother went missing. I had most of my stuff packed up and was ready to move in just a couple of days. We both knew this whole moving thing might cause problems with our friendship, so we wanted to do something fun before I moved out. We did a spontaneous week-long road trip. The morning I left, I didn't move any of the furniture back. It didn't seem necessary. I noticed something strange about the road trip. At no point in the trip did my furniture move. It was the first time since I can remember I woke up with everything looking the same. I thought maybe I found some kind of weird hack. We got back from an amazing trip feeling closer than ever, feeling thankful that we did it. I walked into my room and saw everything just as I remembered leaving it the day we left for our trip. Everything except for my dresser with the front facing down right in the middle of the room. I went over to the front of it to try and lift it into place, but it felt heavy. I immediately felt the memories of the day my brother went missing flash back into my head. This thing being heavy is bad news. I wasn't sure why, but I knew I didn't like it. I called my roommate in to help me move it. At first he was hesitant. He didn't want anything to do with my furniture. Finally, I convinced him to just help me lift it quickly. As we pushed it back up to the wall, the body of a man came falling out. He was dead and limp. Claw marks filled the inside of my dresser. It looked like it fell over while he was hiding in it. He most likely fell over at the beginning of our trip and couldn't get out. He was in the same spot where I found that ominous note a little while back. He also had a gas tank that had a sleeping aid in it that was connected to one of those things that go over your mouth and nose before surgery or something. He looked malnourished and sickly. This man was my ghost for the last 15 years, moving my furniture around, thinking it was some kind of fun game or something. This was the man who took my brother. This was the man who gave a sleeping aid to me and everyone else I lived with so he could move my furniture around for me. This was the man who took away countless sleepovers from my childhood. This was the man who stole my mother's peace of mind, my whole childhood, so I could have some sick game every morning. They never found out who he was. They couldn't find anyone that matched his fingerprints or dental records or anything at all. It's like it never even existed. Most of all, they never found my brother. They never found out how the man got in and out of my house, if he even left, or how he was always around no matter where I slept. They never figured out how he managed to sneak around my living space for so long and not be seen. That was last year, and after that day, my furniture never moved again. My husband's email. Can someone please help me understand this? I am trying to make a sense of what he wrote, but I just can't. Through the tears and fear of losing him, I can't understand any of this. I want to go and check for myself what happened, but I am too scared to take our young son with me. Please help. I can feel it preying on me. I can hear it pacing around right outside of my bedroom door. I don't know what I did to deserve this. I have so much to live for. My wife and child are back home. God, I will never be able to see my son grow, to teach him baseball or football, to teach him how to drive and, hopefully, to make him love cars as much as I do, to see him graduate and become such a talented professional that I know he will be. My dear Angela, I am sorry I won't be there for you. I am sorry I won't be there for you when you need me the most. I promised you that we would be together for eternity, and we will be. I will always be watching over you and Tom. I hope you can somehow feel me and forgive me. Please, love our son for both of us. Move on with your life. Find yourself a new partner to cherish happy moments with. Someone good for you and Tom. Good like I was never able to be. Hopefully you won't forget me, but if you do, that's okay. It won't change my feelings for you. I am sorry I never told you this, but how could I? Would you even be with me if you knew? Would you even believe me? Maybe, I don't know. But that's my burden to carry and mine only. I am a far more, and all of the rumors you heard about my family, all of those you shrugged and defended me from those assholes, they are all true. We indeed are one of the wealthiest families around, but that came with a price. Many years ago, my great-grandfather, living in misery and poverty, hunger, his children dying from it, he found a way out of it. In one of his jobs as a gardener, he went to a secluded mansion in the middle of the forest. There, he met someone he called his savior. A couple of months after working there, he struck gold. He never told his family how, but he suddenly became filthy rich. But it changed him. He became a mean, cruel man. He would hire desperate immigrants, those who had no family around here, and would treat them like trash. He would constantly starve them, beat them, torture them. He had his little torture chamber hidden underground of his enormous land. So many people died there in horrific ways. As he grew old, little by little, he wasn't capable of doing such horrific things anymore, and it seemed to affect him. The less of a torturer he could be, the more sick and debilitated he became. He had one son left, the only one who survived the famine and poverty, Jeff. Jeff was the opposite of him. Jeff was kind, worked charity at the church, donated food, and built houses for the poor. He had no idea of what his father was. But after his father's death, Jeff became colder and colder as the days passed. The workers at their farm were relieved when his father died, but it didn't last long. Shortly after, Jeff started giving them less and less food. He started hurting them a little here and there. A punch, a kick. But suddenly, the tortures once again resumed. Jeff, my grandfather, had a son, Thomas. My beloved father, Thomas, was nothing like Jeff or my great-grandfather. I grew up in that house with him and Jeff. My mother left us when I was 2 years old. I think I can now understand why. I think you remember, how could you not, what happened last year? My dad, who was caring for my grandfather, killed himself. I couldn't understand why. He was so full of life, so excited to see his grandchildren growing. But he did, and he left Jeff bedbound for me to care for. I never liked the man, but I couldn't leave him to die, so we moved to this godforsaken town so we could live near Jeff. Little by little, I was creeped out more and more by him. He would say odd things like it was my destiny to become it, and that was our family's legacy. I thought he was going insane. One day I was exploring the vast mansion, and I found my dad's room. It was eerie and creepy to see his photos, our photos just there, gathering dust. I should have been more present in his life after I left for college and work. There, sitting on his bed, was a weird old book. At first glance, I thought nothing of it, but naturally I was curious. Once I started reading, I noticed it wasn't a book, but rather a diary, one that belonged to my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather made a deal with something he couldn't even name. It granted us a great fortune in exchange for a vessel. What he didn't know was what that meant. You see, when the vessel grows old and is incapable of causing suffering, it craves for a younger one. That's how Jeff became the monster he was. which I only found out reading this kind of diary. It looks like the creature keeps logs of all of his vessel's life. At least he did on my great-grandfather and Jeff's. On the last few pages, the handwriting was different. I recognized it as my father's. Slowly he narrated how, after finding that, he would see odd things around the house. A shadow here and there, the book appearing in weird random places, but places where he was, in the kitchen cabinet, when he was reaching for some food. On the bathroom sink, when he went for a shower. On his closet, his dresser, and on and on. He would hear random sounds at night outside of his room, like someone was impatiently pacing right outside of his bed. It tried to open the door every night, but it was locked. The thing would never say anything, just pace around, but he knew what he wanted. That's why my dad killed himself, to end the curse. But it didn't end it, just delayed it. Right now I can hear it pacing around, violently shaking the knob, pounding at the door. It must be very close to death. Jeff's death, and it needs my body, my mind, my vessel. But I know how to end this, at least I hope so, for the sake of our son. During the day, I soaked the whole house in gasoline. I locked my room and waited for the thing to come out. I know it can sense what I am about to do, and that must be why it is also impatient. And dare I say desperate. This is my last email to you, Angela. Please remember me not as a freak, but rather as your loving husband. Tell our best memories to our son so he can grow up knowing the best part of me. That's all I ask. I love you both. There's a death row inmate who we've executed over 12 times. He won't stay dead. We killed Joseph Glass for the first time on August 18th, 1999. I knew he was a strange case since day one. Never seen a guy so happy to die before. It was like we were doing him a favor. He refused the automatic appeal. He refused to be seen by a chaplain. He just wanted it over with. It had only taken a little over a year, and it was already time for him to make his appointment with God. He freaked me out just passing by his cell. He was like our very own Hannibal Lecter, the way he just stood there in the back of his cell like he'd been waiting for you. The lights always burned out in any cell he was in, and maintenance had gotten tired of fixing them. Not that he seemed to mind in the slightest. The darkness seemed to swallow his top half, and all I could see were the whites of his beady little eyes poking out of all that black. Billy drummed his baton against the bars. Up and Eddie M. Cowpoke, he called in that mocking tone. Time finally come for you to pay what you owe, you sick son of a. Billy Warden-Taft silenced him with a word. If you can't act like a professional, you're going to have to sit this one out. Billy paused and licked his chapped lips. Naw, he muttered. This a show I can't miss. Glass seemed to tick Billy off more than any prisoner before him. He liked him to at least pretend to feel sorry for what they've done or act scared of what's coming to him. This one didn't even have the common decency to shed a tear. He was as stone-faced as a statue, even while being marched to the chair. Billy liked to joke sometimes that we ought to take the guy out back with some car batteries and really put the fear of God into him, get him to cut out that stoic act. I think he was only half joking. After what this guy did to those girls. Well, Billy has a daughter, so I guess it struck a chord. We all watched him fry. The warden, his closest men, the thin-faced man representing the commissioner of corrections, the prison physician, the families of those poor girls. It couldn't have gone more by the book. The only oddity I'd noticed at the time was that the stench of death never quite left the clothes I'd worn that day. And then the next morning we came into work to see the whites of those beady little eyes staring at us from the darkness again. Good morning, sirs, he said, just as he did every morning, in that airy, hoarse little voice. I'll admit it. I dropped everything I was carrying, stumbled back, and stammered like a confused child. Hell, I almost screamed. You're not. Why, you're supposed to be. I don't know what you mean, sir. He leaned in like he was trying to stare a hole through my chest. His tone almost sounded disappointed. You never came for me. You promised me that yesterday would be the end, sir, but you never came. I waited all night long. Why did you lie to me? Me and Taft looked at each other. We both had the exact same question on our minds. If Glass was still alive, who the hell did we roll into the morgue last night? Jesus Christ, Taft gagged when he pulled back the cadaver cover, stumbling away. It's Billy. I looked. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. And I'll be forever haunted by the sight of my friend lying there on his back, mouth agape and cloudy eyes staring into the ceiling, open wide, as if he'd spent his last moments in a state of terror. The public never found out what happened. The cover-up story was that poor Billy had been taken by cardiac arrest. Internally, it was the scandal to end all scandals. Worst case of incompetence and negligence in history, they called it. They brought the hammer down on anyone even tangentially involved. Me and Taft were out on our ears and they would have prosecuted us too, but that would have required admitting it ever happened. But I just could never wrap my head around it. Of those dozens of witnesses, not a single person noticed we were strapping a guard to the chair. Not an inmate. It was impossible to the point of absurdity. Glass had been the man in that chair. I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Some months later, I noticed power flickering off all over the city one evening. It was brief, so I thought nothing of it. At least until I got a call from a familiar number the very next morning. I understand you were one of the staff who regularly worked with one Joseph Glass. We would like to consult with you about an evolving situation. Oh. At 7 p.m. yesterday, we attempted the execution of Joseph Glass. For the second time. There was a long pause, and when the voice returned, the professionalism had melted away, replaced with a baffled anxiety. And, well, it didn't. It didn't work. I blinked. It didn't. What? There came a long sigh. Perhaps it'd be best if you saw for yourself. And just like that, me and Taft had our jobs back. Officially, Joseph Glass had been successfully executed on August 18th, 1999. Unofficially, they tried again 6 months later, just to tie up loose ends. This time he hadn't even had the courtesy to pretend to die. He just sat there on the chair, motionless and unaffected, while the who'd flipped the switch suddenly seized up and began to convulse, screaming and gnashing and wailing as electricity seared him beneath his skin, clawing at his chest until his eyes popped in his skull and rolled down his face like melted candle wax. All around him, lights flickering, machines bursting from pressure, electrical panels vomiting arcs of static. It was a mess. The feds were crawling all over this case now, from a department I've never heard of. Something about investigating preternatural activity. They told me Glass was refusing to speak with anybody but the Kials who'd once cared for him. Being walked into that interrogation room almost made me feel like I, myself, was a convict being marched to his execution. The Glass was staring at me when I walked in like he'd been sitting there, motionless, waiting for me. I expected nothing less. I took a shuddering breath as I sat across from him. I'd sat across from serial killers and psychos before, and showed no hint of fear, but how could I not? Now, sitting across from a man who can kill people without touching them. Glass? Officer Mendez, his tone betrayed no emotion. I had thought you'd abandoned me. I winced. No, Glass, I'd just been temporarily relieved. It's good to see you again. Would you like a glass of water? I offered it to him. He didn't even look at it. His eyes just bored into mine, relentless. I'm here to ask you a few questions. Silence. Okay. Glass, I need to know how you killed Billy and Kramer. I didn't, he replied. It did. The thing standing behind you. I didn't bother to turn around. I had enough experience with prisoners trying to trick me into looking the other way while they pulled off some half-baked escape plan. Glass, please. Let's take this seriously, I replied. I've always treated you with respect, haven't I? You've never had any problems with me. Actually, I do. I have a problem with all of you. Oh. You here all believe that. Death is a punishment. There was the first hint of emotion I'd ever heard in his voice. It's not. It's freedom, the only freedom. You promised me that gift. You promised me you'd let me die. You've given it to so many other prisoners while leaving me behind. With all of your machines and your science and your knowledge, surely you can find a way, if anyone. My throat felt suddenly dry. I had to take a sip of the water myself and hoped it would quell my burning nerves. We're trying our best, Glass. But you have to work with us. It may help if you told us what exactly is preventing us from executing you. He moved for the first time, leaning in so slow as to be almost imperceptible. It won't let me die. And that's when I felt a hand settle on my shoulder from behind. Everything stopped. My lungs stopped inflating. I swear my heart stopped beating, and my blood froze in place in my veins, and it all felt so cold. I could see the hand in the corner of my eyes, long and veiny and black. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I'd once mocked the way deers froze in headlights. Now I understood. I couldn't move, I couldn't blink. I couldn't think. I couldn't even take a single breath. Even as my lungs began to cry out for air, my vision blurred, and my thoughts melded together. All I could see was Joseph's eyes staring into mine. Those infinite fathoms of darkness, that Stygian sea that swirled and stormed and thundered in the blackness of his iris, and the eyes of things waiting for a million leagues below the waters. And I would have suffocated there, too terrified to even breathe, if those agents in black had not called off the interrogation then, and come storming into the room. Later, they showed me the tapes from the security camera. There'd been nothing behind me. Nothing placing its thin hand upon my shoulder. Nothing at all. On May 7th, 2001, Glass was set to be executed for the third time via hanging, or so I heard in some government black site somewhere, far from prying eyes. While it was set to happen, me and Taft were sharing glasses of scotch in his office, nominally to celebrate. Really, because we were scared. Taft always struck me as young at heart, despite his years, but this was the first time the warden had ever looked truly, properly old. He watched the yard below as he had a drink. "Did I ever tell you why I chose this line of work, Mendez?" I shook my head, and he sighed. Back in '63, they found a woman's body in the back seat of a burnt-out car in some state park near my neighborhood. A prostitute, one of her Johns had, chopped her up, burned all the evidence. And you know what got me, Mendez? Nobody cared. Nobody bothered to investigate. Who will notice one less hooker on the corner of Fifth Avenue, right? It didn't sit right with me. The way I see it, Mendez, every life matters, even the ones we try and cast aside. Everybody's got people who love them, and childhood memories, and all that. Everybody deserves justice, no matter who they were. He set down his glass and looked me in the eyes. So I joined the force, got the case reopened, found the guy, and I watched him fry. And I like to imagine she was there watching too, as he burned. There was a tense moment, and then a chuckle. Course, after that bullet to the hip in '71, I couldn't walk the beat anymore. But I've been just as happy here. Watching justice be served makes me feel like there's some kind of karmic order to the world. Good deeds and bad deeds get repaid in kind. It was clear there was something lurking beneath his words, some unspoken thesis. Eventually, with old, wrinkled, tired eyes, he said it. "I've thought about it, and if Glass doesn't die tonight, I'm finally going to retire," Mendez, he confessed. After what he did to those girls, what kind of order can there be in a world where a monster like that is just beyond justice? I was shocked. Warden Taft always struck me as an unmoving fixture. What would we do without him? "He'll die, sir," I promised. "It'll work this time. It has to." But he seemed deeply uncertain. With one last shuddering drink, he leaned forward. His eyes, he stared at my expression, as if desperate for me to understand, for me to know. Those things, in his eyes, haven't you seen them? And at that moment, Taft was yanked up out of his chair. It was so sudden, so inexplicable, I could barely register what I was witnessing. Some unseen force lifted him 2 or 3 feet above the ground, dangling him there. He choked, coughed, and sputtered, desperate to gasp down the air that would not come, and clawed at something around his neck, which I could not see. He was hanging, I realized, and with wide, horrified eyes the same as Billy's had been, he silently begged me for help. I sprang from my chair and wrapped my arms around his dangling legs. At first, I tried to pull him down to the floor, but I realized it was only tightening the invisible noose around his neck. Then I tried lifting him as high as I could, which gave him some relief, but not much. Tears rolled down his face as it swelled and turned blue, and even though I could not see the noose, I could see the bruised purple skin where it had squeezed around his neck. All the while, I screamed myself hoarse. Help. Somebody, please. Jesus Christ, we need help in here, but nobody came. And all of a sudden, some unseen force seemed to sweep my feet out from under me. I dropped like a bag of bricks. But I was so startled. I maintained my grip around the warden's legs. I fell and yanked him down with me, and his body suddenly jolted with a sickening crack. It took me a while to manage the courage to look up at him. His neck had been stretched far too long, and his head was bent to the side at almost a 90-degree angle. Eyes wide, round, and bloated tongue hanging from dry lips. And then whatever force had suspended him disappeared, and his body fell upon me while I screamed and screamed. I came bursting from his office to find my coworkers casually chatting and working just outside. Somehow, despite all my screaming and begging while Taft was dying, none of them had heard a thing. I took a page from Taft. I wanted out. We were dealing with something unholy here, something whose tendrils could reach any distance, and my life, who knows, maybe even my soul was at hazard. But the agents in the sharp suits made one thing clear: if I refused to cooperate, well, I would make the perfect scapegoat for the murder of Warden Taft. I was marched into the interrogation room to find Joseph Glass, who had abandoned all pretense of humanity. His eyes had darkened to a pure black. Or perhaps he had no eyes at all, only windows into some place of outer darkness. I was shaking like a leaf as I sat in front of him, feeling more like a prisoner than he was. Mister. Glass, no reply. I shuddered, trying to focus on my little piece of paper to distract myself from the blackness of his eyes. I have some questions I'm supposed to ask you. Is that okay? Silence. I take a deep breath. How old are you, Glass? I thought it was just one of those basic questions. Conversation starters, really. I couldn't have prepared myself for his answer. I am old. Child, his voice was nothing as I remembered. It was deep and low and rumbling, like there were multiple people speaking in unison, and all were equally ancient. Older than you could possibly know. Older than this nation, and older even than the empire that once bore it. I had to fight the basic animal instinct to flee. Focus on the questions, I thought. Why did you do what you did to those girls? Just so I could feel something again, he whispered. Anything. Did you not feel the slightest bit of guilt, remorse? You ask that. Of me. Me, who has watched empires rise and fall. He almost sounded amused. Does time feel remorse? For time has killed far more than I. But mankind is like the Hydra. All I've killed will be replaced by essentially identical stock and in greater numbers. And then they will die and be replaced. And so the cycle will continue forever. Did you expect me to pity them for being given the death I myself covet? Only the dead are given leave of the cycle. It is a blessing, and suddenly he stood from his chair, as if he'd never been restrained at all. A blessing you promised me, Officer Mendez. I stared up at him in disbelief. What? How did you? But I couldn't even stammer a sentence out before he was upon me, crawling over the table with the eerie grace of a spider. These were no longer the imperceptible hints of emotions I'd come to expect. It was like a switch had been flipped. Tears streamed down his cheeks, snarling with genuine rage, hurt, betrayal, and beneath those black seas in his eyes, all the things that haunted the fathoms below were rising to the surface. You owe me a death. Make good on your word. Pay your debt. I cried out and recoiled from his every touch with disgust. But he was stronger than he looked. I couldn't worm my way out of his impossible grip. I won't. Get off of me, you sick bastard. Do it. Pay me what you owe. It was like 1,000 different voices screaming in my ear. Straining and weeping, I locked my hands around his neck and pressed my thumbs against his throat, trying to strangle him. But instead, I could just feel that grip upon my own neck, squeezing the life out of myself as my lungs burned for air. Yet I kept pressing harder and harder as if hoping I might somehow break through whatever unholy force was protecting him. And then, those terrible hands grasped my shoulders again, and I was paralyzed by a terror that could be called nothing but ancient and primal. Like the thing standing behind me was the same force that had kept my ancestors huddled and terrified in their caves 100,000 years ago. And every one of those voices was crying out to me through my very blood. And it pulled me from my chair, threw me as though I were weightless. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the infirmary. Once more, none of this was captured on the security camera. In the footage, I just enter the room and have a seat with strange, almost robotic movements. And then the both of us just sit there, staring at each other, without speaking, without moving, without blinking, for an hour. After this, Joseph Glass entered a catatonic state, and from then on refused to converse with even me. Now that my usefulness had ended, the agents discarded me like yesterday's trash. Don't even seem to care if I tell anybody. Who would believe me? I thought I'd gotten lucky, that my nightmare was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Go sorting through any public records, and you won't find a single mention of the name Joseph Glass. They've squirreled him away in that off-the-books black site and scrubbed away every other trace of him. I'd say he'd been unpersoned if indeed he could ever be called a person at all. But they're still trying every execution method in the book. I don't know quite why. Maybe it's for research. I'm sure the US military would love to find the secret to making its men as unkillable as Glass. And besides, they're not the ones who have to deal with the consequences. On June 3rd, 2005, they tried a firing squad. I know this because I and my wife were out on our second honeymoon, slowly dancing by the lake at night to our favorite song, when I felt a wetness against my chest. I looked down to see her eyes as gray and dull as foggy glass, and her chest shredded to Swiss cheese by rounds that made no sound. On December 23rd, 2012, they tried lethal injection. That was the day they found my son's car wrapped around a tree, and baffled coroners discovered that he was dead before the accident even occurred, his bloodstream polluted with pavilon and potassium chloride. It's been years since I've isolated myself from everyone I knew, hermiting away in this cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and yet the stench of death still follows me. Just a couple of years ago, I found a news report mentioning my nephew. Apparently, he'd been found completely exsanguinated. His veins emptied utterly despite no signs of a struggle. God knows what kind of arcane methods of execution they're trying by now. He's not going to let me walk away from this. Not while I still owe him a debt. But I've been doing some research, too. Research into those untold legions of things I witnessed staring up from that blackened sea in Glass's eyes. I've learned things men were not meant to know. Practice rites and assemble tools and ingredients. And I think I know where they're keeping him. Even though they blindfolded me, I counted the second between every turn on our way to the black site, and I've since spent weeks watching the place, cataloging every entry point. Maybe I'm slipping into madness. Or maybe I've truly found a way to put an end to the horror. To finally give this monster the justice that Taft would have wanted for him. Joseph Glass had been right about one single thing: I have to pay what I owe. Even if it kills me,